you start to say to yourself, well, what is real? What is true? And so you begin to question information that is actually truthful, but you don't really know.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Man in the Middle podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Mullally. This is an Ithaca Media podcast. And today I'm joined by Meg Tapia from Novexus, who's a national security expert. She has over 20 years of experience around intelligence, diplomacy, and tackling disinformation, which is one of the topics we're going to be discussing today. She has served as a diplomat and been recognized with the national and also a NATO medal, which is fantastic. And she's one of the leaders in addressing security challenges here in Australia. So I want to welcome Meg to the podcast. And before we dive into it, we were joking before we even set up this podcast that we'd have to retitle it Woman in the Middle podcast, which we'll have to do today. But Meg, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you so much for asking me to be here and to talk about this topic. I think it's really important, which is why I'm so passionate about it. But if I can reach a bit of a broader audience through your pod, then I'm really grateful to do that. So thanks for the invite. And hopefully, I did tell you earlier, my cat is here in the room. She's currently asleep on the floor, but she doesn't disturb us over the next kind of 30-ish, 40-ish minutes. We'll see how we go.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We'll try not to distract her too much and make sure she can have a nice restful sleep. But you were telling me a bit before we started recording, Meg, just a bit about your background and how you came into security. And I was wondering if you could share a bit about your journey, how you got into this area of security and why you're so passionate about it.
Yeah, thanks. So you're right. So long-standing worked in government. In fact, before I became a consultant, which was really only about 3 years ago, I was in government for about 20 years. So I describe myself as a public servant at heart. I believe in public service, and I believe in the important role that government plays. We have a really important system of government, I think, here in terms of democracy. I believe in democracy. Everybody has the chance to vote for their government, to select who it is that they want to govern them and to represent them. So I've always been drawn to that. I traveled the world as a diplomat, which was incredible. I had the opportunity to see elections all around the world. So I was privileged enough to see national elections in Papua New Guinea, in Vanuatu, and in Afghanistan during that first and only peaceful transition of power in Afghanistan. And here in Australia as well. So every election I volunteer. I'm one of the 105 or so thousand people around Australia who are paid volunteers. We get paid for the day to make sure that democracy on election day is working, right? So that gives you a bit about my values and who I am and why I do this. The disinformation piece started back in around 2019, 2020, when of course we went into lockdowns for COVID. And I was working at the Department of Foreign Affairs at the time, and there was a lot, you'll recall, of mis and disinformation online about COVID, about the origins, about the impact, about the health components, about vaccinations. There was a lot of rumours that were swirling on the internet and people were sharing with each other. And so the Australian government decided to counter or to tackle this infodemic, which was the word used by the World Health Organization at the time, by establishing a counter disinformation task force in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I was lucky enough to be in that team. That has since evolved. It's now about strategic communication. It's about the broader information environment rather than just countering disinformation specifically. But that's really kind of the genesis of where this interest in dis and misinformation specifically started. My focus is, or the area that I think is really important to focus on, is is foreign malign influence. I think we need to be very aware of that. And that's, I think, natural for me, given my career has been in foreign affairs. And so I've got a natural interest in what's happening in the world around us and the way that we interact with the world and the world affects us. So that's a little bit about my background. I started Novexus about 18 months ago because I saw a couple of reasons. I saw a need to help government, but also private companies who were really struggling with what was disinformation just completely blowing out of control, I think you would agree, over the last 10 years in particular. This is a word, or these are words, these are concepts that weren't part of our vocabulary. They weren't part of our conversation. And now we're talking about them pretty much every day, and indeed here. So that's a little bit about me and my background, Jeremy.
Yeah, that's excellent. Like, before diving further into some of these areas, could you just explain the difference between disinformation versus misinformation? Because I think that's something that viewers or listeners might question at the outset. Could you explain what that distinction is between those two terms?
Yeah, I'm going to throw another one in here as well. I'm going to throw in malinformation. We talk about mis and dis, but there's also mal. And then I'm also going to throw in propaganda, okay? Let's think about this as a bit of a spectrum, and it's a spectrum of intent. So the fundamental difference between disinformation and misinformation is the intent that someone has to deceive or cause harm. Now, that's really hard to determine, because how do I know what you're thinking, or how do I know what your intent is when you decide that you want to put something out online? But the best way to think about it is misinformation is information that's spread because you believe it to be true. So it might not be, but you believe it to be true. Your intent is not to harm anyone. Your intent is not to deceive anyone. You genuinely believe that what you're distributing amongst your social network or your offline network, at Christmas, there's always someone who's got a theory about something, right? You believe that to be true. Disinformation is about intent. So the intent is to cause harm or to deceive. You are knowingly putting something out into the conversation, into social media, which is intended to deceive you in some way, right? There might be a nugget of truth in there, but the fundamental of it is that it's false information that is misleading and is intended to mislead you. Malinformation is something else that we're talking about now increasingly. It hasn't yet really made that the media or the kind of social conversation, but malinformation certainly exists. And this is where you've got a piece of real information, but it's been miscontextualized. And so this has been happening a lot lately in relation to images. So, for example, when we saw the breakout of the conflict between of Israel and Gaza, with Hamas, we saw a lot of images that were purporting to be about that conflict. So images of online games, images of conflicts from elsewhere, people who were taking images or videos of themselves purporting to be in a conflict zone. These are all real images, but they're being miscontextualized to make you think that they're of something else. So that's malinformation. And then the other important one here that I think we don't often talk about is propaganda. So propaganda is a lot like disinformation in that it's false and intended to mislead, but you know where it's coming from. You know it is coming from a government, it is coming from someone who is state-backed. So that's the kind of four key component parts. Propaganda has been around since the dawn of time. You can go back in kind of the history books and in books about historical wars, and you'll see elements of propaganda in there. It's fundamentally about how do I influence, as a state, right, as the authority, as the government, how do I influence my people, but also how do I influence other countries as well? But they know that it's coming from me. That's the fundamental difference. Disinformation, I think what makes it really harmful is that you might not actually know the provenance. And often it's intended to hide the provenance of that information. So there's a covert element to it.
Yeah, okay. And it sounds like, especially like from the distinction between misinformation and disinformation, it really comes down to the intent. And that's really fascinating to me. And like you're already alluding to the fact that it is difficult to discern that, but how do you make that determination around the intent behind someone distributing that information? Because like what it sounds like, it could be the exact same piece of information, but coming from two different sources, there might be an intent that's malicious or has like intent to cause harm.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, how do you sort of make that?
So it's really hard, right? And this is the problem, I think, with the conversation we're having in Australia at the moment around content moderation and about who should determine what content is real content or fake news, right? Who determines the authenticity? Who determines the truthfulness of a piece of content? So that's why it's really hard. But the way I like to think about it and the way I describe it to people is that if you think about disinformation as a kind of small component where there is very much that intent and where the narratives are being constructed in order to cause that harm, right? There's a layer outside of this, which is people who would naturally believe that information for whatever reason. There's many reasons why people are susceptible and believe those narratives. Those people are that kind of second order, which are picking up what's being put to them purposely and are then distributing it further. And that's the nexus between the disinformation and perhaps a wider bubble of the internet, which is the misinformation. There's a little nexus in there where people who are vulnerable and who are to the information and for many reasons are picking that up and then spreading it themselves without realizing the original intent or the provenance of that.
Yeah, okay, and it sort of brings us to the intention behind distributing this, like from the propaganda angle, because if it's a state actor, we can all understand, and we've got examples in history of why you would do that. But why would someone distribute disinformation beyond sort of propaganda purposes? Like what are some of sort of the reasons that people do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We need to find some people and ask them.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Look, I think we can categorize. So the reason and the individuals who do this are kind of aligned, right? So who does it and why they do it are very much connected concepts. So there's broadly, to my mind, three broad groups or categories that combine the who and the why. So the first we spoke about, which is foreign malign influence, foreign governments, right? So propaganda fits in here for sure, but it is not covert, it is overt, right? We know that it's happening. It's state-run media outlets, which we see in a number of authoritarian governments around the world. It's allies and influencers that are connected to state. That's kind of in that propaganda space. And they're putting out, as governments do, their message about what concerns them, what they're doing, why they're doing it, right? At the more kind of concerning end of that scale is propaganda, which is seeking to, or messages that are seeking to perhaps clamp down on dissenting views. We don't have that in Australia. That's what makes us, that's what makes democracy great. But that does happen elsewhere, where if you have a dissenting view of government policies, government activities, then you may be subject to propaganda yourself, right? So foreign governments. So why would they do this? Well, the first is linked to this. It's about ideology. It's about ideology and control. It's about their desire to create a narrative around who they are and what they do and what they stand for. And then the second reason why a foreign government might spread disinformation, particularly into another country, or another region outside of theirs, is influence and interference. They're seeking to change the narratives, change the conversation, sow dissent. There's a range of kind of objectives in relation to this, but the fundamental reason is to interfere in the politics and the governance of another country, right? So that's group one. The second group, which we don't talk about enough, I think, and is increasing in, I think, the problems that we face is domestic sources of disinformation. And here you'd put into this bucket conspiracy theorists, just trolls, just people who just outright, want to troll each other or want to just spread dis and misinformation because it brings them joy. I don't know. Supporters of political violence might use this as a tactic, but in many countries, and I don't know if Australia is excluded from this. Politicians themselves sometimes will engage in false narratives because they want to, maybe they're standing for election. There are things that they want to keep hidden about their own conduct. They don't want to be transparent about things. So there is a level of responsibility I think politicians have to take. That's the second kind of bucket. And then the third grouping and reasoning is financial. And we really don't talk about this at all. But this is individuals who are financially motivated and they are incentivized by social media structures, because the way that programmatic advertising works and the way that recommender algorithms work mean that you can get an income through advertising revenue by spreading information that is attractive. And right now, the most attractive kind of information that people want to click on is information that is unfortunately not true, but it's very emotive. It's making people angry. It's clickbait, right? So that's the third kind of category. And here it's around, let's see, let me give you an example. There's a concept or a term which is called pink slime. I'm not sure if you've come across it. So pink slime is the word given to websites that look legitimate but are not, right? And they're filled, so they might look like, say, ABC News, or they might look like CNN, so that's impersonation, or they might look like a really legitimate news outlet. I live in Canberra, so it might be called, when we have here, I think Canberra Times, but it might be called, the Canberra Daily, right? Not actually a real paper, but sounds like it might be. And it's just filled with content that is false content that is designed to make you click and be interested, because the more click that website gets, the more advertising revenue they have, right? Because that's the way programmatic advertising works. So that's that third bucket that we really don't talk about enough, but the fundamental driver of that is really financial, and it's about those the social media incentive structures.
Yeah, okay. And thanks for bringing that one up as well, because I'm not familiar with that term, but obviously familiar with the what's the mechanisms of what's happening there. But a couple of things you said there.
Can I say in here, for your listeners today or viewers, if you Google doppelganger, so doppelganger Operation Russia, that'll give you a really great explanation with some real examples about how it is that some Russians have done this with state backing.
Great. All right. Yeah, we'll have to do some research into that one too. That's fantastic. I wanted to ask you, Meg, just one of the things you're speaking about there, and it made me think of, I want to ask around, wrapped up in this disinformation piece, do you find that over the years, and especially in Western countries like the US and Australia as well, that the sort of trust and faith in the media has been eroded over time, so that therefore even information that might be genuine can be labeled perhaps falsely as misinformation or disinformation. And I'm thinking, like the term has been popularized now, fake news, by a former now president-elect of the US. And that's a common term now, and that's actually just part of our vernacular. Like again, we were saying at the beginning of the episode, that's quite common now. But what I'm asking is like, do you find that even there's almost like another category now, which is information that's genuine but that could be dismissed as fake or misinformation?
Yeah. So what you're describing has a name. It's called the liar's dividend. Okay. And what that means is when you're in an environment in which truthful information and disinformation coexist, it's very difficult for you as a user, as a consumer, as a citizen to be able to tell the difference between what's truthful and what's not truthful. And so what happens in that kind of environment is that it erodes the trust of the institutions which do promote truth, right? But when there are other institutions that sit alongside it, like the Pink Slime, for example, or Doppelganger, which purposely promote untruths, then it becomes really difficult. And you start to say to yourself, and it's very natural, this is human, okay? So there's no flaw here, it's just the way we are. You start to say to yourself, well, what is real? What is true? And so you begin to question information that is actually truthful, but you don't really know, right? So you start to doubt that. And the liar's dividend is where I have actually done something, right? And someone exposes that I have done that thing, right? The liar's dividend is that I can say that's not true, that's fake. And it allows me space to get away with having done something that I did actually do, but by saying that that's not true. So this is the problem that we're facing in society at the moment, is that disinformation undermines the integrity of the system and the society in which we live, right? Democracy depends on the consent and the confidence of the people who are being governed. And if that confidence is undermined and that consent becomes questioned, I start to question my consent about whether or not I really did vote in this government, then the democracy itself and society itself starts to unravel. So then we start to get into really deep kind of psychological space, which is around, well, why do we do this as humans? There's lots of research that goes into that. I don't know that we want to go into it here. I'd rather focus more on kind of the operational elements, but there is a lot of research into why that happens and why we're susceptible to that, and also how it is that as humans we can kind of build our cognitive strength, practice that cognitive muscle to get better at it. Actually, I've got a book that I'm going to recommend.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Which is this one just here. I read a lot. I don't know if you can see this. It's called Foolproof, and the subtitle is Why We Fall for Misinformation and How to Build Immunity. I hope that...
Can you put it a little bit higher, slightly bit higher, if you could? Other way?
Oh, this way?
Yeah, because yes, great, yeah.
Okay, so this is a really good book. Because what it does is it talks about the psychological foundations of why it is that we as humans naturally are susceptible to being lied to, right? But also what it does is it's got some really great recommendations in there about how to build kind of immunity, because this was written around COVID times, how to build immunity to misinformation. And I'm sure we'll get to kind of solutions, so I'll touch on it there. But this is a really great book if anybody's interested in doing a little bit more, kind of light reading into this space.
Yeah, excellent. We'll make sure that we've got that in the description and everything. That sounds great. And you were just touching on then, like around the, the importance of information in democracy, because like you were mentioning, in order to have a functioning democracy, you have to have a well-informed public, and the information must be genuine, authentic information that you can that can be verified and so forth. So, like given, because like you're saying at the beginning of the episode, like not only in Australia do you participate in the election process here, but you've seen that in other countries as well. Could you talk a bit to that piece of just how important having authentic information is for the democratic process, particularly for elections, which is like an example of how we participate in a democracy?
Yeah, so I have seen elections play out around the world, and in places that practice democracy in different ways to the way we do in Australia. I've seen kind of practices play out where villagers will get together and they will, as a community, choose who it is that they want to vote for, and so everybody goes to the polling place and votes for that person. If that's what they want to do, that's okay. I think the fundamental here, though, is that they are consciously making a choice, right? You have the freedom to make that choice about who it is that you want to vote for and who you want to represent. Here in Australia, we have compulsory voting. If you register, you must vote. And I think this is actually, in many ways, what saved us as a democracy, because you have to participate. You can choose, once you're in the voting place, to to have an informal vote, or in Australia we call it a donkey vote, which is that you vote for no one, right? Or you decide to do whatever it is you want on your ballot. And I've seen lots of interesting things drawn on ballot papers over the years.
We could have a podcast just on that. I'd love to ask you some things about that, but maybe not for this episode.
But what matters in this is that you have the choice, right? And so that's why electoral integrity is so important, in particular in democracies, because elections, there are many components that are part of a democratic system that are really foundational, and open, free and fair and open media is one of those, for example, right? But so are elections. Elections are really critical, very central to the way that we function as a liberal democratic society and with our liberal democratic government. So, if you're registered to vote, go exercise your right. Now, the second element of this is that we respect who is chosen. We respect the will of the majority of the people, and within the context of our system of voting, to allow whoever is chosen to govern us to have that opportunity to govern, right? But you have to, as a citizen, be making those choices on the basis of truthful information. If I'm trying to decide between party A or party B, and part of that information is not truthful, then it could sway my vote, but it could lead to who knows what kind of outcome. So the truth and the integrity and the transparency of the information that we receive around policies is really important. So that's why political integrity is really important. Now, of course, things change, things happen, events occur, which means that governments have to adjust. That's really natural. But the idea that, that there are political parties that are out purposely putting out dis and misinformation in order to just win votes, I think is kind of fundamentally, wrong and flawed within our system of democracy. And so we need to have those checks and balances on that.
Yeah, well, let's talk a bit about that, like more generally, because I do want to touch on the solutions to, combating disinformation and misinformation. And where does that really start as far as defending ourselves against that, Meg? Yeah.
So I explain this through three kind of levels, right? And all of this is first of all a recognition that it is a whole of society concern. This is not you, Jeremy, as an individual in isolation. It is not the companies that we work for just for themselves, and it is not the government needs to tackle this on its own. It's everybody, right? So we all have a role and a responsibility to play, in my view. At the highest level, in terms of, kind of, let's call it, it's not actually really government. Government has a role to play, but it's really at the national level. So at the national level, I think the first thing you've got to have is a strategy. You have to have a plan of action. You have to acknowledge that this is problematic, that this is a concern, that and our government has, but it's acknowledging it, I think, in very, very kind of piecemeal, isolated ways. You know, the different types of regulation that have been proposed over the last 6 months, some of the initiatives and efforts that have been pursued by the government, they're all very good, but they're all being pursued in isolation, and there hasn't been an overarching strategy that says, actually, here's all of the elements and the components that we need to deal with. So that's, I think, the first thing you've got to do. And then you've got to acknowledge that everybody has a role to play. So government absolutely has a role to play, has a role to play in terms of regulation, has a role to play in terms of coordination, has a role to play in terms of intelligence agencies, understanding the nature of the threats, particularly where they're foreign threats or where they're threats that are linked to extremism or terrorism or really sowing disunity. Absolutely. So they have a role to play, but so does media. You mentioned media earlier. Media has a role to play. One of the things that I say is that disinformation flourishes because it's free. Truthful information is hard to get because it's behind a paywall, right? You want to get really good, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Australian, other publications, you got to pay for it. And in the current cost of living crisis that we have in Australia, what are you going to choose? Are you going to choose to pay for news, or are you going to choose to get free news, which might be of lesser quality, and you're going to use that money for something else, right? But the other piece to this is also local journalism. So having localized stories that are about the things that affect us in our communities is really important. So local journalism is a component of that kind of media landscape. And the other piece here is also tech companies. So tech companies absolutely have a role to play. A lot of the disinformation and misinformation that's spread at the moment is spreading online. And so they really need to up their game, and they really need to think about those incentive structures and the downstream consequences, the second order consequences of those incentive structures and of paying people for content. And then finally, there's a kind of education piece, and that is around digital literacy, media literacy. There are countries in Europe who are fantastic at this. We should be taking a leaf out of their books and really, really doubling down on digital literacy. In my view, the decision by the government to ban people who are children under 16 from social media is a kind of band-aid to a broken arm, right? It's dealing with the symptom and not the cause. And so concurrently, we have got to educate our kids about online harms, how to navigate the internet, and this has to start very young, and it has to continue all the way through their education so that as they grow into adulthood, they have the skills to be able to discern fact from fiction and to be, better at critical analysis. That's what this is about. But there are things that you can do as an individual. So take notes, Jeremy. You are also
got the pen ready.
And this is the first step, which is ask questions, stay informed, acknowledge that this is a problem that we face and that you as an individual are affected, right? So that piece is really important. And then from a cyber perspective, because you do focus on cyber, I think it is important to have really good protocols. So making sure that you have really good passwords, that you've got really good online hygiene, that you're staying aware of the kind of individual threat landscape is part of that critical thinking and that kind of awareness. And thinking about maybe auditing, what kind of groups do you belong to? What is the What is the provenance of those groups? What is the intent of those groups? Could you do a personal media audit and decide, well, am I getting the kind of content that I really want to get? And maybe the answer is yes, and you want to continue down that rabbit hole, and that's okay. It's entirely up to you. But you've got to make that choice, right? And you've got to be very conscious about that. And so that's the kind of final element, which I think as individuals it's really important to do, which is you have personal responsibility for verifying the content you consume and not being a passive consumer of the things that are sent to you. So the way to think about it is, if it's making you angry, if it's making you fearful, if it's making you think about another group as other, as different to you, if it's founded in conspiracy, then it's probably disinformation.
Yeah, that's great. And that last piece, like, again, it sort of comes back to that that education component, doesn't it? As far as having a certain level of media literacy, because like my concern is that, you know, just the rapid involvement of how we engage with the media, like filtered through, you know, sort of social media platforms and so forth, has changed so rapidly that we haven't been able to keep up with, I suppose, an understanding of how we even engage with that. Like, so for example, like you're kind of saying, or and you know, we've talked about it a bit in this conversation too, is the more you engage with a certain type of content, the more you're going to get recommended that. So you sort of further and further going down a rabbit hole, and you won't be you like your whole, not your whole, but like a large part of how you view the world is going to be shaped by the media you consume, right? So having an understanding of that allows you to take, like you're sort of suggesting, taking a step back and like, you know, how is this making me feel, and you know, how do I feel about a certain group of people, or you know, this type of information can be really helpful. But just on that, like around the technology piece, Meg, like things like AI, for example, when we're talking around, you know, elections and things like that, I wanted to ask you just a little bit around the AI piece, and if you have anything to comment on that and how that might affect disinformation and misinformation, and how we, you know, engage with the media.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you raise. I want to go back just real quick on a really simple way that you can kind of check whether you've gone down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And that is, I mean, it's very vulnerable, but find a friend, someone you trust, who's not going to judge, and share with each other, show each other your, if you're on Instagram, your kind of Instagram search and recommender pages. See how you come to, you'll see that your world, what you're shown, is very different from somebody else's world. And that should be a really good starting point for you to start to question, what am I being recommended and why am I being recommended it? So very easy. But on AI, yeah, AI and tech, absolute game changer. AI has been around for a long time, but it's been about sorting data. The game changer is generative AI. And in particular, the creation of content, visual, audio, and video content, which looks realistic. That's going to be really problematic, because how will I know that what I'm seeing is real or if it's AI generated unless there's a way for me to tell quite rapidly? And that's probably through regulation. And then the other piece to this is generative AI text, in which content can be hyper scaled. Disinformation content can be hyper scaled. It can be more attractive. The tone, the language, the currency of it can be more attractive to the user, and it can be used to micro target individuals based on their worldview. So it's deeply, deeply concerning. I think we've really got to get a handle on generative AI specifically. But part of the challenge is that this is just the next evolution. Something else is going to come that's going to further affect the landscape and change the dynamics and the threats that we face. So in regulating this, we've also got to be open-minded to the possibility of new technologies which we haven't yet even imagined. So we do need to take, I think, a very wide view of the kind of regulation and the regulatory structures that we want to have in place, rather than think about the problem we face right now, which might be generative AI. But yeah, it's deeply concerning. And I think if you were to just Google online, realistic AI images. In fact, I do that as part of my presentations. So I start my presentations with slides which have both real and AI generated content. And I ask people to tell me what's a real photograph that's been taken by a human and not edited, and what is an AI generated photograph. And no one wins the game.
Yeah, like, and it's striking, like, just how, realistic that difference is. And like, I've seen things circle around where, like, it's sort of like, say, politicians, and we've already talked about the implications that can have, especially around elections and so forth, having those sorts of images circulating around. But we are unfortunately coming to the end of this conversation, Meg, and I want to end on a lighter note than sort of doom and gloom of what this could be. And you've already given us some advice around how we as individuals can combat against disinformation. But I suppose I want to ask you, like, since we were talking about the future, like, where do you see like a more positive future? Like, what can we do to create that future that's much more a much more positive one, and a much more brighter one, if we're combating disinformation in the correct way?
Yeah, look, I think, gosh, that's tough, right? Because you can never go backwards. You can only move forwards. And so I would hope that we're at perhaps we're not there yet, but perhaps we're coming to an inflection point in society and in life and in the world, where we have some pretty hard choices to make about what kind of society do we want to be? What kind of society do we want to leave for our children? And if the answer is, well, we want that one that's founded on liberal democratic values, because that's what we value. We want one that's founded on tolerance and equity and freedom, and on respect and on genuine justice. Those are liberal democratic values. Well, then we have to fight for that. And we have to make choices that enable that kind of society to flourish. And it's not about pointing the finger at people and saying, you're wrong. So please, this Christmas, don't go to, your uncle or your cousin and point the finger and go, that's disinformation, you're wrong. Because that gets you nowhere. It's actually very much the opposite of that. It's about taking a step back and doing what you're doing. It's about having a conversation and being curious and being open-minded and saying, look, we see things differently, and I might not change my mind, but help me understand from your perspective what you see, right? It is absolutely a fundamental of democracy, thriving democracy, that we have differences of opinion. Absolutely. We should debate policy, and we should debate what do we want this country to look like, right? But when the fundamental facts are the things that we can't agree on, then that's where we've got a problem. So we've got to try to edge closer, I think, to determining, what is truth. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I don't think I can add more to that. I think that's an excellent way to close off this conversation. But that being said, Meg, I really want to thank you for coming on. I've had an amazing time speaking with you, and this could have gone on for a lot longer, because there's so many interesting areas that we can touch more on. But I want to ask, just so our viewers and listeners are aware, how can people find out more about yourself and the work that you do? How can people get in touch?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, having a little bit of a coughing fit over here. It's springtime and the pollen is out, so it's hay fever all around.
Oh, goodness.
I know, so perfect timing to close. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Meg Tapia on LinkedIn, or my website is www.novexus, novexus.com.au. There is actually a whole other category that we haven't even touched on, which is about companies and disinformation targeted at companies for various motives, including to devalue those companies, to affect stock markets, to affect company reputation. There's a whole other space here that absolutely exists. And so companies are interested in having that conversation, or just having a conversation about how they can, educate their boards or educate their teams about mis and disinformation and how to kind of guard against that in a really positive and healthy way, then absolutely people can reach out to me.
Fantastic. And to be honest, that sounds like the topic of our next episode together, Meg. So we'll have to organise that one, because that'd be really fascinating to dive into. But yeah, once again, really want to thank you for coming on, Meg.